a wide zone of continental rifting, where Nevada has essentially doubled its real estate. I'm going to focus in on the Northwest Basin and Range. Extension in this area is more recent and was initiated probably in 2 phases of extension. The first between 8 and 14 million years ago, and the most recent probably beginning about 3 million years ago and continuing today. Extension is greatest in the south, about 12 to 15% through this area, and decreases to 0 moving northwards. Zooming in a little bit more to my field area, the Larkspur Hills, the cliffs that you see here are faults that cut 3 to 8 million year basalt flows, so represent the earliest phase of extension. Faults at the surface are younger than 3 million years, and likely have not been active since the Pleistocene. This is a picture, since you haven't been there, looking south. The only unit exposed in the study area are thin basalt flows, 1 to 5 meters thick, interbedded with difacious sediments. And the top here is an originally flat-lying basalt flow that has been cut and offset by normal faulting, with predominantly east-facing fault scarps. And the red line is the dip slope, or the top surface of the basalts, which was originally horizontal, but in much of the field area has since been tilted. I began working in this area as part of a larger project to understand the geothermal potential and fluid flow in the valley, which is indicated by hot springs at the surface. Hot springs occur on both sides of the basin in Surprise Valley. So this is the field area here, and this would be the basin. On the east side, these do not appear to be along faults, but faults are a primary control on fluid flow. Faults expressed at the surface could be a useful analog for the buried intrabasin faults. Faults control fluid flow because of the intense fracturing that occurs along the fault plane, to the side of the fault plane, which increases permeability in the rocks. These zones of intense fracturing tend to be greatest at zones of intersection, overlap, or where faults splay upon their terminations. So initial examination, the faults in this area seem to have different orientations, which led to the first question was how do fault orientations in this area relate to the regional stress field over time? And another question was what controls the differences in fault orientations going from south to north throughout the field area, with an initial hypothesis that the overall difference was the result of a change in stress direction, and another hypothesis that faults in the south differed due to reactivation of a larger structure at depth. Main factors that control normal fault geometries are stress orientation, or in the larger extension direction, pre-existing structures, changes in stress orientation or extension direction over time, and heterogeneities in the crust, such as changes in lithology. For brevity, I will focus mainly on these first 2 for this talk. So again, this is my field area. In addition to some regional studies, there has been recent work that has been more targeted throughout the area that I will refer to as it becomes relevant to my study. Although I am going to start with Kreider's work. While she had a small field area here in the northwest corner, her work necessitated establishing the extension direction for the whole region. So using a variety of data throughout the region in comparison to previous studies, she found fairly consistent agreement in extension orientations that are just slightly off of a due east-west trend to slightly east-northeast to west-southwest. This is important. Let me briefly introduce you to this slide first. Sandbox models are analogs, physical analogs, that allow us to control the factors that affect fault geometries. And in addition to other field studies and numerical models, I looked at sandbox models. Faults should form perpendicular to extension direction in a homogeneous medium. If there's a zone of weakness that's oriented obliquely to the extension direction, there are still some irregularities in the fault trace, a little bit more irregularity in the fault trace. But these faults still work together to accommodate that overall east-west motion, and irregularities are consistent through the model. Irregularities due to just fault growth in response to extension direction are a result of fault growth mechanisms. The first of which is when tip lines propagate, tensions in the tip line at first cause those tips to diverge, then converge. The faults eventually intersect, and this creates an irregularity, a hook-shaped irregularity in map trace. A more common mechanism is when faults overlap, a ramp begins to form. The ramp will develop fractures, eventually break, again, forming a larger through-growing fault with an irregularity and fault trace. These irregularities tend to be really short compared to the overall fault length, usually less than 12%. So these are surface traces as a result of those fault growth mechanisms. However, another process can be responsible for the same traces in map view, and that is the reactivation of a large structure at depth, which leads us into the next control, which is pre-existing structures. In this slide, I'm showing a large fault, a very large fault, rupturing through subsequent cover. However, there can be small distributed faults that reactivate. In this study, they were studying the angle of the pre-existing structure to extension direction and what effect that would have on the resultant fault traces. So as you can see, is these faults are at a high angle to extension. They're optimally oriented to slip, so continue as a dominant fault set. With the linking structures are the new faults that are forming in between them. So irregularities in the fault trace where these linking structures could be larger than what we would see from just fault growth along tip lines. In this model, the pre-existing structures were at a lower angle, so those were reactivated as linking structures between newer segments that were consistent with the new extension direction. There can also be a change in extension direction during a period of extension. So faults will form perpendicular to the extension direction. However, as the stress field rotates, at some point it will reach an angle where new faults can begin to form while these faults continue to be active. So these faults continue to accumulate displacement but also serve as nucleation points for new faults to form. And then these faults can link, again, forming very irregular fault traces where linking segments would be expected to be much longer than the ones we would see through normal fault growth. If these faults are well developed enough, they can also serve as barriers to rupture. So while these four faults propagate, they end and intersect here rather than cutting that larger structure. So I mapped faults beginning with hillshade models generated from DEMs. One of my DEMs was high-resolution LiDAR, which covered this area. It's not shown in this slide because it is of such high resolution it really looks bad zoomed out this far. And this had half-meter resolution. In order to map further extent, to extend my field area, I downloaded a DEM from the USGS that has, it was from a digitized topographic map with 3-meter spacing, so it has 3-meter resolution. So I looked for prominent cliffs. In some areas, there were smaller features that were harder to distinguish. This is as far as I can zoom in on the larger DEM. So fortunately, in some of those areas, I had LiDAR, which helped me to see some of these smaller features better. This is actually as far out as I can zoom with the LiDAR and have good resolution. At the time, Google Earth, when I started this project, Google Earth imagery wasn't as good as it is now. So I also found the high-resolution aerial photographs to be quite useful, particularly in areas where I did not have the LiDAR data. And also, these can all be at the same projection so that I can overlay one layer over the other and everything matches up, and I can map without any errors. Fortunately, Google Earth improved, so that helped me refine my mapping and target field sites. So that's just an angled view of the same feature. And then I was standing here when I took this photograph, because nothing takes the place of field work. Okay, but with such a large field area, these helped me to target where I went in the field. A fault scarp looks like this in my field area, so I'm not going to be able to take strike and dip. Okay? So to calculate extension, if you remember the slide where I showed the yellow was the scarp and the red was the dip slope is very resistant to erosion, so tilt could be measured directly off the topographic line. However, I had to assume fault dips based on regional, so I assumed a minimum of 65, which is shown, and a maximum of 80, and that's within the 60 to 90 range for the region. I also, as we've talked about, linking structures can be from pre-existing structures, they can be fault growth mechanisms, and those sizes help to distinguish which is which. So in addition to looking at overall fault length, I also drew best fit lines along the fault trace. Used a plugin in ArcGIS to calculate all of those azimuths. I exported this into Excel, normalized the segments to fault length, and sorted them based on percent of fault length, so I could look at segments at any range of scales for the fault. I exported these also to Stereo to plot on Rose diagrams, which are essentially histograms arranged on a compass, which you'll see in a little bit. I divided the area into domains based on fault density and orientation. Domain boundaries occur primarily along north-northeast and north-trending faults or basins. So the cross-section show the dominant style of faulting, which is down to the east, bookshelf style faulting, with the magnitude and percent extension decreasing northward across the field area. Within the domain, I analyzed data within the domains, primary characteristics, tilting of the fault blocks. So as an example, domain 1, north-south striking faults, 5-degree tilt, which tapers off to the east. Mean orientations of segments throughout the domain were roughly north-south. I also graphed, okay, the blue dots would be more to the east orientation and the open dots more to the west to see how the orientations varied along strike. And this allowed me to match azimuth to scarp height and to segment length. So these are all plotted at the midpoint of the segment, so the spacing of the dots helps me to get information about the segment lengths as well. So by contrast, domain 2 has a different primary characteristic, different strike for the faults, different amount of block tilting which tapers off in this direction. The mean segment orientations was different on the Rose diagrams, and the faults graphed differently, which helped to support my decisions on grouping the faults by domains. Domain boundaries were also analyzed separately, and again, a different mean segment orientation, and the faults graphed differently. So these helped to support my designation of those as boundaries. So in terms of the control of extension direction on this field area, while there are differences in the mean segment orientations throughout the domains, on average, all of these work together to accommodate an extension direction consistent with the least compressive stress of 267 degrees, which is in good agreement, excellent agreement with Juliet Kreider's work. With this extension direction, we would expect to see north-south trending faults. However, in my field area, we see both the north-south trending faults and two distinct fault sets that are seen throughout the field area, north-northwest and northeast. So, one explanation for that could be pre-existing structures. These are from the Sandbox models that we saw earlier, and these are inferred coinciding pre-existing structures with fault traces in the field area. The best agreement is in the northwest trending fault set. There's less agreement in the possibility of pre-existing structures to the northeast, but this could be due to a lower angle of the pre-existing structures or a better developed structure here. A better developed structure here may represent a barrier to rupture on this fault set, which is supported by the fact that none of these faults actually cut this fault. Now, the north-northwest and northeast segments dominate to the north, and that is also where I see linear volcanic vents that mirror those orientations that predate the faults. That was also found by Scarberry et al. In the region where mid-Miocene dike alignments followed the same trends as the two fault sets and led them to conclude that it's likely that with east-west extension, the fault sets were exploiting the same pre-existing fabric as the fault sets. South of this area, north-south trending faults with dominantly hook-style linkages, which are fault growth linkages, dominate. So this may represent a boundary at depth. Again, this has implications for geothermal systems. If the faults at the surface are to be used as an analog for the subsurface, it may indicate that the fault controls in this area could be different from the fault controls in this area. So the major conclusions that there are pre-existing structures that exert a strong control on surface geometries only in the northern part of the field area, not the south. That linear volcanic vents that predate the faults are consistent with east-west extension and with the two fault sets, supporting the fact that extension direction has been relatively constant since about 8 million years. And north of the field area, the north-northwest and northeast trending faults are dominant. North trending faults are not present. The regional transition is captured within the field area, suggesting that there may be a structural or lithological boundary at depth separating fairly homogeneous crust to the south from a more heterogeneous crust to the north. And of course, research is not done in a vacuum, and I'd like to thank these following people for their help with this project. With that, I would entertain any questions that you might have.
What are the potential
terms of geothermal potential, the Northwest Basin and Range has been studied. The USGS studies it just theoretically in terms of how are fluid pathways controlled by faults. But there are private interests that are trying to determine whether or not there's an economic benefit to geothermal research in this area. And faults represent conduits for fluid flow. They can also represent barriers too. So understanding the types of intersections, interactions, fault terminations can help us to identify the size and shape of potential geothermal reservoirs in the basins.
Time for another question. If more questions from the audience? Yeah.
What was the most interesting part of this study for you?
Oh boy, that's difficult. It was a very complex area to study, and so for me, that's what's really interesting. Is how do you tease out what's going on in an area where, I mean, it's the north. I would say basically the western United States has a very complex history, complex deformational history. So to look at an area like this, was it change in extension? Was it pre-existing structures? Could it be a combination of both? So I think just overall it was just a very interesting project in terms of its complexity.
Did you ever determine the I guess reason for why those pre-existing structures were built? What led those to become
okay. One possibility is it's called non-planar strain, where instead of having, usually we have sigma 1 is vertical, it's the maximum compressive stress, which in this case would be gravity acting on rock. And then the least compressive stress direction would be the direction of extension. And then you have an intermediate going the other way. Normally those are 90 degrees to each other. Okay. In some areas, sigma 2 and sigma 3 can be so close that they can actually flip back and forth. And so you can have faults forming under a sigma 3 going this direction, but then if sigma 3 switches this way, you can have faults forming at a different angle. So that is something that has been brought up, whether or not this was the result of an orthorhombic fault pattern as a result of just non-planar strain or oblate strain. Another explanation that I have found quite interesting is from an older study done by Donath in 1962 in the Summer Lake, which is the same area that Kreider worked in. He hypothesized based on the angles between the faults and the fact that throughout the area, not in my area, but throughout the rest of the region, the cross-cutting relationships are mutual, indicating that both sets were active at the same time, that these were conjugate strike slip faults. So they fit the pattern and the difference in the angle between the two fault sets is consistent with conjugate strike slip faults as well. That would also account for the steep dip on these faults, and that as this area evolved into an extensional regime, that those strike slip faults were preferentially oriented to slip under an east-west extension. So the blocks started to tilt and accumulate dip slip motion. So that is another possible explanation for the pre-existing structures. I considered that a change in orientation as the faults are expressed at the surface seemed less likely simply because there's 3 distinct sets rather than 2 that would be determined by conjugate or a flip in the extension direction. The oblate faulting, the non-planar strain, predicts 4 fault sets.